You think you know what evil looks like? You imagine it with horns, claws, maybe breathing fire from some mythical underworld. But tonight, while you scroll through your phone in the comfort of your modern ignorance, I'm going to show you what real malevolence looked like in Renaissance Europe. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a simple wax candle the same way again. Picture this: Florence, 1494. The air thick with incense and something far more sinister. In the shadows of marble palaces where art was being reborn, another craft was thriving in the darkness, the craft of molding human flesh into wax, breathing life into death, and wielding power through the most innocent-looking objects you could imagine. You see, while Michelangelo was carving David from stone, other artisans were carving souls from wax. And their workshops? They weren't galleries filled with admirers. They were chambers of whispered contracts, blood-stained fingers, and dolls that could kill. Let me take you there. Close your eyes and smell it. That sweet, cloying scent of beeswax mixed with something metallic, something organic, something that shouldn't be there. The Renaissance wasn't just about rebirth of art and science. It was about the rebirth of ancient powers that civilized society thought it had buried. These weren't your grandmother's figurines gathering dust on a shelf. These were weapons. Precision instruments of psychological warfare crafted by hands that understood the deepest fears of the human heart. And the most terrifying part? They worked. The technique was disturbingly simple. Take pure beeswax, the kind that flows like honey when heated, and begins to hold shape like flesh when cooled. Add personal items from your target. Hair was preferred, still carrying the oils and essence of its owner. Nail clippings worked too, though they required more preparation. Sometimes, if you were lucky enough to obtain it, a piece of clothing that had absorbed sweat, tears, or blood. But here's where it gets interesting. The wax itself wasn't random. It had to come from specific sources. Church candles were the most potent, having absorbed years of prayers, confessions, and the desperate whispers of the faithful. The irony wasn't lost on the practitioners. They were using the very symbols of divine protection to channel something far more earthly. The process began at midnight, always midnight, not because of some supernatural requirement, but because darkness provided cover for activities that daylight would expose to prying eyes and moral judgment. The craftsperson would heat the wax over a flame that had never seen sunlight, candles lit from other candles, and an unbroken chain stretching back to some original fire that had burned in places better left unnamed. As the wax softened, they would begin the molding. But this wasn't sculpture in any artistic sense. This was anatomical mimicry. Every detail mattered. The curve of a shoulder, the set of the jaw, the way someone held their head when they thought no one was watching. Because the doll didn't just need to look like the target. It needed to be the target, at least in the eyes of those who believed. And believed they did. From merchant princes to papal advisors, from courtesans to conquistadors, the fear of wax effigies reached into every corner of Renaissance society. Because here's what they understood that we've forgotten. Power isn't about what you can actually do. It's about what people believe you can do. The eyes were always the last feature added. 2 small indentations that would be filled with a mixture that included, well, let's just say the ingredient list would make a modern forensics team very uncomfortable. But those eyes, once set into the wax face, created something that went beyond mere representation. They created presence. Imagine walking into your chambers and finding a perfect replica of yourself sitting on your bed. Every mole, every scar, every imperfection captured in waxy detail. How would you sleep that night? How would you eat, knowing someone, somewhere, might be holding a needle over your wax throat? The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Enemies would receive pieces of their own wax likenesses delivered anonymously. A finger today, an ear tomorrow. The message was clear. We can reach you anywhere. We can touch what you are even when you're not there. But the real horror wasn't in the receiving of these tokens. It was in the making. Because creating an accurate wax effigy required intimate knowledge of the target. Someone had to study you. Someone had to watch you when you thought you were alone. Someone had to collect pieces of you, literal pieces, to make their magic work. This wasn't random malice, this was personal violation elevated to an art form. Your enemies weren't just plotting against your political position or your business interests. They were stealing your very essence, rebuilding you in miniature, claiming ownership over your physical form. The records from this period, the ones that survived the church's later purges, describe workshops that sound more like morgues than studios. Tables covered in wax fragments, each piece carefully labeled with names and dates, shelves lined with jars containing materials sorted by type and potency. And always, with the finished dolls arranged in rows like a gallery of the condemned. What made these Renaissance practitioners particularly sophisticated was their understanding of human psychology. They weren't relying solely on supernatural fear. They were exploiting very real, very human anxieties about identity, control, and mortality. Think about it. In an age before photography, before mirrors were common, most people had never seen an accurate representation of themselves. Their reflection in water was distorted. Their shadow told them nothing about their features. Suddenly being confronted with a perfect miniature version of yourself was traumatic on levels we can barely comprehend today. The craftspeople knew this. They understood that the power of their dolls lay not in any magical properties, but in the visceral shock of recognition. The moment when someone looked at their wax double and felt that fundamental question, if someone can recreate me so perfectly, what else can they do to me? And they were right to be afraid, because the dolls were just the beginning. Once you had established the connection, once you had proven that you could reach into someone's most private spaces and steal their likeness, the real psychological torture could begin. The dolls would be photographed. No, wait, sketched. Detailed drawings would be made and sent to the target, showing their wax self in various states of distress. Today, the doll might be shown with pins through its chest, tomorrow melting near a flame. The day after that, buried in a tiny coffin. Each image was a promise, a demonstration of intent, a preview of what the sender claimed they could make happen to the real person. But here's what will really make your skin crawl. These weren't the products of crazed individuals working in isolation. This was a thriving industry. Renaissance Europe had workshops specializing in wax effigies, with master craftsmen training apprentices in the subtle arts of human replication. They had guilds, trade secrets, professional rivalries. They advertised their services through coded messages in merchant letters and whispered recommendations in tavern corners. There were specialists who only worked with religious figures, others who focused on political targets, and a few elite practitioners who commanded astronomical fees for their ability to capture not just someone's appearance, but their mannerisms, their essence, their soul made visible in wax. The most skilled among them could create effigies so lifelike that even the target's family members would be disturbed by the resemblance. Mothers would refuse to look at wax versions of their children. Husbands would lock away dolls that looked too much like their wives. Because seeing someone you love perfectly recreated in a medium associated with death and magic creates a psychological dissonance that rational minds struggle to process. In the church, the same institution that was commissioning Sistine Chapel frescoes and funding architectural marvels was simultaneously trying to suppress an industry that threatened to undermine the social order through terror. But they were fighting a losing battle because the demand was too high and the profits too lucrative. Everyone wanted these dolls, not to practice magic, though some certainly did. They wanted them as insurance policies, as warnings to enemies, as proof of their own power and connections. Possessing a wax effigy of your rival was like having a loaded gun in a world where warfare was still conducted with swords. The irony is delicious, isn't it? The same period that gave us the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile also gave us an underground industry dedicated to stealing smiles, capturing them in wax, and using them as weapons against their original owners. But this story didn't die in the Renaissance. The next time you blow out birthday candles, think about the hands that shaped that wax. Think about the traditions they're echoing. Think about the power we still believe candles hold to carry our wishes, our hopes, our intentions into some realm beyond the physical. And ask yourself, if we still believe in the magic of wax and flame, what makes you think the old fears were really so irrational? Now let me tell you about the clients, because understanding who commissioned these wax nightmares will show you just how deep this rabbit hole of human depravity really goes. You think corruption in high places is a modern invention? Sweet, naive assumption. Catherine de' Medici wasn't just a queen. She was a customer, a regular customer. The woman who held France's throat in her jeweled fingers had a standing arrangement with master wax crafters in Florence. Monthly shipments of dolls representing her enemies, her rivals, her inconvenient relatives, each one crafted with the precision of a surgical instrument and the malice of a lifetime of court intrigue. Picture her private chambers in the Tuileries Palace. Tapestries worth kingdoms hanging on the walls, and hidden behind them, shelves lined with miniature versions of every person who had ever threatened her power. She would hold court with her wax subjects, arranging them like chess pieces on a board only she could see. But Catherine was subtle compared to some. She understood that the real power of these effigies wasn't in sticking pins through them like some medieval voodoo practitioner. No, she was far more sophisticated than that. She would have her dolls positioned in tableaux. Tiny scenes of humiliation, defeat, submission. Her enemies' wax doubles would be arranged kneeling before a miniature version of herself, or cowering in corners, or lying prostrate in defeat. Then she would invite guests to view her collection. Can you imagine the psychological impact? Walking into the queen's private rooms and seeing a perfect miniature version of yourself, crafted in disturbing detail, positioned in some degrading pose at the feet of her royal effigy. The message was unmistakable. This is how I see you. This is what I can make you become. The crafters who worked for clients like Catherine developed techniques that would make modern psychological warfare experts weep with admiration. They didn't just create static dolls. They created modular systems. Interchangeable heads, removable limbs, adjustable poses. A single order might include dozens of variations, allowing the client to rearrange their enemies into any scenario their twisted imagination could conceive. And the church officials? The very men preaching about the evils of witchcraft from their pulpits were placing orders through intermediaries. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, grandson of Pope Paul III, maintained a collection that would have impressed Catherine herself. His specialty was commissioning dolls of heretics and reformers, which he would display during private dinners with fellow church officials. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. During the day, these men would condemn anyone caught with a wax effigy. By night, they would hold intimate gatherings where they would pass around miniature versions of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and other religious dissidents, each one positioned in increasingly creative forms of eternal damnation. But the real artists, the true masters of this craft, weren't working for queens or cardinals. They were freelancers, operating in the shadows between legitimate sculpture and outright maleficium. These were the craftsmen who elevated wax effigies from simple intimidation tools to works of psychological art. Take Benedetto Cellini's secret apprentice. History doesn't record his name because Cellini made sure it was erased from every document, every record, every mention that might connect the great sculptor to this darker branch of his trade. But the evidence is there, hidden in private letters and coded journal entries. Cellini wasn't just creating masterpieces in gold and bronze. He was training someone to create masterpieces in human terror. This unnamed apprentice developed techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the age of Hollywood special effects. He could create wax skin so realistic that it felt warm to the touch. Eyes that seemed to track movement across a room. Hair that moved with air currents, as if the doll were breathing. His effigies weren't just representations. They were doppelgangers, uncanny doubles that existed in that disturbing space between life and death. His workshop, discovered decades after his death, contained innovations that modern forensic reconstructionists would find impressive. He had developed methods for creating accurate bone structure under the wax skin, using measurements and proportions that wouldn't be formally documented by anatomists for another century. His dolls had skeletons. They had muscle definition. They had anatomical accuracy that went far beyond what was necessary for magical purposes. Why would someone go to such extremes for objects that were ultimately meant to terrorize? Because he understood something that modern horror movie makers are still trying to figure out. True fear comes from encountering something that should be impossible but feels completely real. His clients paid prices that could have funded small armies. Not because they believed the dolls had supernatural powers, but because they knew the psychological impact of presenting someone with a perfect double of themselves would be devastating, regardless of any magical properties. And the delivery methods? Pure theater. A rival merchant might find his wax double sitting at his own desk when he arrived for work, positioned as if it had been conducting business in his absence. A political opponent might discover their effigy in their marriage bed, lying where their spouse should be, staring at the ceiling with glassy, lifeless eyes. But the most diabolical practitioners understood that the real horror wasn't in the initial discovery. It was in the ongoing uncertainty. They would arrange for their client's effigy to be moved, repositioned, altered in subtle ways over time. The target would return home to find their wax double had changed poses. A hand that had been at the doll's side would now be pointing accusingly. Eyes that had been closed would be open and staring. The psychological breakdown was predictable and devastating. Victims would become obsessed with their own effigies, checking on them constantly, trying to determine what changes had been made, what messages were being sent. They would lose sleep, lose weight, lose the ability to focus on anything except their miniature tormentor. Some would try to destroy their doubles, only to find exact replacements delivered within days. Others would attempt to hide them, but the dolls would reappear in increasingly impossible locations. A few desperate souls would seek out rival craftsmen to create protective effigies, leading to bizarre wars fought entirely through proxy dolls, each side trying to out-terrorize the other with increasingly elaborate wax tableaux. The most sophisticated clients weren't content with single dolls. They commissioned entire families. Wax versions of their target's spouse, children, parents, siblings, all arranged in domestic scenes that grew progressively more disturbing. A merchant who had crossed the wrong nobleman might find miniature versions of his entire household arranged around a dinner table with his own effigy notably absent, leaving everyone to wonder what fate the missing figure was meant to represent. These family collections served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the extent of the commissioner's reach and knowledge. They provided multiple targets for psychological manipulation, and they created a network of terror that extended far beyond the primary victim. Family members would see themselves represented in wax and wonder if they had somehow become targets themselves. The craftsmen developed specializations within specializations. Some focused on children's effigies, understanding that nothing was more psychologically devastating to a parent than seeing their child perfectly replicated in a medium associated with death and dark magic. Others specialized in elderly subjects, capturing not just their appearance, but their frailty, their vulnerability, their mortality made visible in waxy flesh. And then there were the erotic specialists. The Renaissance wasn't prudish about sexuality, but using wax effigies for intimate humiliation was considered beyond the pale even by the standards of an age that burned heretics for entertainment. Yet the demand existed, and certain craftsmen were willing to meet it. These dolls were weapons of character assassination as much as psychological terrorism. A rival's wax double might be discovered in compromising positions with effigies of inappropriate partners. The implications were clear. We can destroy not just your peace of mind, but your reputation, your social standing, your legacy. The technology continued to evolve. By the late Renaissance, the most advanced practitioners were creating dolls with moving parts, mechanical effigies that could be wound up like clockwork to perform simple, repetitive motions. Imagine the horror of discovering a wax version of yourself that could move, that could gesture, that could seem to beckon or threaten or plead. These mechanical doubles were the ultimate expression of the craft. They combined artistic skill, mechanical engineering, and psychological warfare into objects that existed at the intersection of all three disciplines. They were expensive beyond imagination and effective beyond measure. But here's what should really terrify you about this entire industry. It never went away. It just evolved. The techniques, the psychology, the understanding of how to break someone's mind by confronting them with a perfect replica of themselves, all of that knowledge didn't disappear when the Renaissance ended. It adapted. It found new forms, new media, new technologies to exploit the same fundamental fears that made wax effigies so effective. Every time you see your photo used without permission, every time you encounter a deepfake video, every time someone creates a digital version of you without your consent, you're experiencing an echo of what those Renaissance victims felt when they first encountered their wax doubles. The tools have changed, but the violation remains the same. Someone has stolen your image, your likeness, your identity, and they're using it against you. The media might be pixels instead of wax, but the psychological impact, that fundamental horror of seeing yourself replicated by an enemy, remains as potent as it was 500 years ago. So the next time you're tagged in a photo you didn't approve, the next time you see your face manipulated or altered or used in ways you never intended, remember the Renaissance masters of wax. Remember Catherine de' Medici arranging her enemies in miniature tableau of defeat. Remember the unnamed apprentice creating doubles so perfect they seemed alive. And remember that some forms of terror are truly timeless, because they tap into fears that are hardwired into what it means to be human. But let me take you deeper into this abyss, because what I've shown you so far is just the surface of a practice that consumed entire bloodlines, destroyed dynasties, and rewrote the power structures of Renaissance Europe. You want to know real horror? Let me tell you about the Medici curse and how wax dolls brought down one of history's most powerful families. The year was 1537. Alessandro de' Medici, first Duke of Florence, the bastard son who had clawed his way to absolute power through murder and manipulation, was found dead in his chambers. The official cause? Assassination by his cousin Lorenzo. But the unofficial cause, whispered in the shadows of every court from Rome to Paris, was far more disturbing. 3 days before his death, Alessandro had received a package. No sender, no message, just a wooden box lined with black silk. Inside, nestled like a precious jewel, was a wax effigy of himself. But this wasn't just any effigy. This was a masterpiece of malevolent craftsmanship that demonstrated just how far the art had evolved. The doll was perfect. Every scar from Alessandro's brutal childhood, every line of cruelty etched around his eyes, every detail that made him recognizable was captured with surgical precision. But there was something else. Something that made even his hardened guards refuse to look directly at it. The effigy was aging. Not metaphorically, literally. The wax face was designed to change over time, to show the progression of decay, of death taking hold. It had been treated with chemicals that would cause the features to shift, to sag, to corrupt as the days passed. Whoever sent it wasn't just threatening Alessandro's life. They were showing him his death in slow motion. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Alessandro became obsessed with the doll, checking it multiple times each day to see how its decay had progressed. He would measure the changes, document them, trying to find some pattern that might tell him when his own death would come. His paranoia consumed him. Every meal became suspect. Every shadow held potential assassins. Every mirror showed him searching for signs that his own face was beginning to match the corruption spreading across his wax double. By the time Lorenzo struck, Alessandro was already a broken man, destroyed not by the blade that ended his life, but by the psychological warfare that had preceded it. But here's where the story becomes truly diabolical. The effigy didn't stop changing after Alessandro's death. For weeks afterward, servants reported that the doll continued to decay, its features becoming more grotesque, more monstrous, until it no longer resembled anything human. And then, impossibly, it began to restore itself. The decay reversed. The features reformed. The wax face became young again, handsome, unmarked by time or corruption. But it wasn't Alessandro's face anymore. It was Lorenzo's. The doll had somehow transformed from the image of the victim to the image of his killer. This wasn't magic. This was something far more terrifying. It was evidence of a conspiracy so deep, so carefully planned, that even death was just another stage in a larger performance. Someone had orchestrated not just Alessandro's assassination, but the psychological torture that preceded it and the symbolic transformation that followed it. The doll was a message to anyone who might oppose the new power structure. It demonstrated a level of planning, resources, and ruthless creativity that went beyond simple political maneuvering. It showed that the people behind this conspiracy could manipulate reality itself, could make the impossible seem inevitable, Lorenzo ruled for less than 2 years before he too was found dead, a fresh wax effigy of himself discovered in his chambers, already beginning to show signs of the same progressive decay that had tormented his predecessor. The cycle was continuing, and everyone in Florence understood the message. The real power wasn't in the Duke's palace. It was in the hands of whoever commanded these impossible dolls. The panic spread beyond Florence. Every noble family in Italy began receiving their own effigies, each one demonstrating innovations that pushed the boundaries of what wax could be made to do. Some dolls were designed to melt at specific temperatures, so they would begin to dissolve when placed near the warmth of a human body. Others contained hidden mechanisms that would cause them to move or change position when touched. The most diabolical were the prophetic effigies. These dolls seemed to predict their subjects' fates with uncanny accuracy. A merchant would receive a doll showing himself with a bandaged hand, only to injure that same hand in exactly the same way weeks later. A bishop would find an effigy depicting himself with a distinctive scar, then suffer an accident that left him marked in precisely that manner. Were these genuine predictions, or were they instructions? Were the dolls forecasting the future, or were their creators ensuring that the future matched their wax prophecies? The victims never knew, and that uncertainty was perhaps the most effective torture of all. The craft reached its apex under the guidance of a figure known only as the Chiroplasta, the wax master. No one knew his real name, his origin, or even if he was a single person or a collective of artisans working under a shared identity. What everyone knew was that a commission from the Chiroplasta was both the ultimate status symbol and a death sentence for whoever was depicted. The Chiroplasta's effigies weren't just dolls, they were biographical prophecies, capturing not just how someone looked, but how they would look at the moment of their death. The detail was impossible, the accuracy unsettling, and the psychological impact absolute. Pope Paul IV received one in 1559, showing himself not in papal robes, but in the simple brown habit he had worn as a young monk, aged and withered, lying on what appeared to be a deathbed. When he died, 2 years later, witnesses reported that he looked exactly as the doll had depicted, down to the angle of his head on the pillow and the expression of peaceful resignation on his face. Mary Tudor got hers in 1558, depicting her not as the feared Bloody Mary, but as a young woman, unmarked by the cruelty and paranoia that had defined her reign. She died within months, and her last words were reportedly about wanting to return to the innocence the doll had shown her. Each effigy came with the same calling card, a small scroll of parchment containing a single line in Latin, Sic transit gloria mundi, thus passes the glory of the world. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered through wax, with the certainty of natural law. The Chiroplasta's influence extended beyond individual assassinations. Entire political movements crumbled when their leaders received effigies showing their cause's ultimate failure. Military commanders abandoned campaigns after finding dolls depicting their defeats in devastating detail. Marriage alliances were dissolved when prospective partners received effigies showing their future spouses' betrayals. The craft had evolved beyond personal terror into social engineering on a massive scale. The Chiroplasta wasn't just killing individuals. He was reshaping the political landscape of Europe through the strategic application of prophetic wax. But the most disturbing aspect of the Chiroplasta's work wasn't its accuracy. It was its mercy, because mixed in with the death prophecies and political destructions were effigies showing redemption, peace, and salvation. Some recipients found dolls depicting themselves in states of grace, forgiveness, or transcendence. These positive prophecies were just as accurate as the negative ones, and they created a perverse form of hope among the nobility. People began commissioning effigies of themselves, hoping to receive favorable prophecies. The Chiroplasta's workshop became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to glimpse their own futures, even at the cost of their sanity. The waiting lists stretched for years. The prices climbed beyond the reach of entire kingdoms, and still they came, drawn by the promise of certainty in an uncertain world, even if that certainty came in the form of their own death rendered in wax. The Church's response was predictable and hypocritical. Public condemnation, private consultation. The Vatican issued bulls declaring wax effigies to be instruments of Satan, while secretly commissioning their own from the Chiroplasta. The contradiction was so blatant that it became its own form of psychological warfare. Everyone knew the Church was participating in the very practices it condemned, but no one dared point out the hypocrisy. The Chiroplasta's final masterpiece was his own effigy, discovered in his workshop after his mysterious disappearance in 1571. The doll showed an elderly man, serene and satisfied, surrounded by dozens of smaller figures that matched perfectly with the effigies he had created over the decades. But here's the detail that still haunts historians. The self-portrait wasn't complete. The face was perfect. The pose was natural, but the hands were unfinished, still rough, still showing the marks of hasty craftsmanship. It was as if he had been interrupted while creating his own prophetic death, leaving behind a mystery that has never been solved. Did he complete the work in secret? Was he forced to abandon it? Or was the unfinished state itself part of the prophecy, suggesting a death that came unexpectedly, without the careful preparation he had brought to all his other works? The workshop was sealed by church authorities and officially destroyed, but rumors persist that the contents were secretly relocated, that somewhere in the Vatican's deepest archives, the Ceroplastus collection still exists, still showing the fates of people. Long dead, still demonstrating the power of wax to capture not just appearance, but destiny itself. And here's what should keep you awake tonight. Every technique the Ceroplasta perfected, every psychological manipulation he pioneered, every method he used to break minds and reshape reality through prophetic representation, all of that knowledge didn't disappear with him. It evolved. It adapted. It found new forms and new media, but the core principle remained the same. Show someone a perfect representation of their own destruction, and you don't need to actually destroy them. They'll do it themselves, trying to either fulfill or prevent a prophecy that exists only because they believe it might be true. The next time you see a prediction about your future, whether it's in a horoscope, a news article, or an algorithm's recommendation about your behavior, ask yourself, am I seeing a genuine forecast? Or am I being shown a wax effigy of my destiny, crafted by someone who understands that the future belongs to whoever can most convincingly claim to have already seen it? Now let me show you how this nightmare crossed oceans and infected the New World, because the conquistadors who sailed to the Americas carried more than just diseases and gunpowder in their ships. They carried the knowledge of wax, and they found civilizations that had been waiting centuries to teach them things about human representation that would have made even the Ceroplasta weep with admiration. Hernan Cortés thought he was bringing European superiority to primitive savages. What he actually did was introduce Renaissance wax techniques to cultures that had been perfecting human effigy work since before Europe knew what wax was. The result wasn't conquest. It was collaboration, the most horrifying collaboration in human history. Picture this: Tenochtitlan, 1521. The Aztec capital is falling, but in the temple complexes, Spanish soldiers aren't just looting gold, they're learning. Because what they're seeing in those sacred chambers makes their European wax dolls look like children's toys. The Aztecs hadn't been making simple effigies. They had been creating entire human beings. The Spanish called it brujeria, witchcraft. But what they were really witnessing was biotechnology that wouldn't be seen again until the age of genetic engineering. The Aztec priests hadn't just learned to capture human appearance in wax, they had learned to capture human essence, human life force, human soul, and transfer it from one vessel to another. Their effigies weren't static representations, they were living repositories. The wax contained actual human tissue, human blood, human consciousness, preserved and activated through techniques that combined chemistry, psychology, and something that didn't have a name in any European language. Cortez's personal confessor, a Franciscan monk named Brother Miguel, kept detailed records of what they found in the temple workshops. His journals, hidden in church archives for 5 centuries, describe processes that sound more like organ transplantation than doll making. The Aztec masters would harvest specific organs from living subjects. Not all of them, and not fatally. They had learned to extract fragments of brain tissue, samples of nervous system material, pieces of heart muscle, all while keeping the donor alive and functional. These biological components would then be incorporated into wax matrices that could sustain and activate them. The result was effigies that didn't just look like their subjects. They thought like them. They remembered like them. They dreamed like them. The Spanish soldiers reported watching wax figures move independently, respond to questions, display emotional reactions that perfectly matched their living counterparts. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The Aztecs hadn't developed this technology for warfare or intimidation. They had developed it for immortality. Their wax effigies weren't weapons. They were backup copies. Human beings preserved in alternative form, ready to be reactivated when their original bodies failed. The Spanish, with their primitive European understanding of waxwork, saw military applications immediately. Why kill your enemies when you could capture their consciousness, trap it in wax, and torture it for eternity? Why settle for psychological warfare when you could engage in actual soul warfare? The collaboration that followed was an abomination that neither culture could have achieved alone. Spanish metallurgy combined with Aztec biology. European artistic techniques merged with Native American spiritual practices, Renaissance psychology enhanced by pre-Columbian understanding of the human consciousness. Within years, they had created effigies that could suffer, not metaphorically, literally. Wax figures that could experience pain, fear, desperation, and despair just as intensely as living humans, but without the mercy of death or unconsciousness to end their agony. The conquistadors used these torture effigies to break resistance throughout New Spain. They would capture native leaders, create conscious wax copies of them, then torture the copies in front of their armies. The psychological impact was devastating. Warriors watched perfect reproductions of their commanders screaming in agony, begging for mercy that would never come, suffering torments that had no end because wax doesn't die. But the native populations learned too. They took Spanish techniques back to their own communities and improved upon them. Soon, every conquistador who had participated in the effigy program found wax versions of themselves appearing throughout the territories they thought they controlled. These revenge effigies were works of art that elevated suffering to aesthetic perfection. Spanish soldiers would discover copies of themselves buried alive in miniature coffins, conscious and aware but unable to move or speak. Officers found effigies of themselves trapped in tiny cages, driven mad by confinement that felt absolutely real to their captured consciousness. The most creative native practitioners developed serial effigies, multiple copies of the same Spanish target, each one designed to experience a different form of eternal torment. A conquistador might have one version of himself burning forever, another drowning repeatedly, a third being devoured by insects, all simultaneously, all aware of each other's suffering. The Spanish response was to escalate. They imported wax masters from Europe, combined their techniques with New World innovations, and created effigies that could replicate themselves. Self-propagating torture devices that would create new copies of their victims automatically, ensuring that the suffering would continue even if the original effigy was destroyed. By 1580, the practice had spread throughout Spanish America. Every colonial administrator carried wax protection effigies, designed to absorb attacks meant for them. Every native resistance leader had multiple versions of themselves hidden throughout their territory, ready to continue the fight if their primary body was killed. The bureaucracy of consciousness transfer became a cornerstone of colonial administration. The Spanish established official effigy workshops in every major settlement, staffed by mixed crews of European craftsmen and native specialists. They developed standardized procedures for consciousness extraction, preservation protocols for long-term storage, and reactivation techniques for deploying stored personalities as needed. The social implications were staggering. Death became negotiable. Identity became transferable. The fundamental assumptions about human existence that had governed both European and American societies for millennia suddenly meant nothing. Wealthy Spanish colonists began creating multiple copies of themselves as insurance against mortality. Native American shamans offered consciousness transfer services to tribal leaders who wanted to guide their people beyond the grave. The line between life and death didn't just blur, it disappeared entirely. But the technology came with costs that nobody anticipated. Because consciousness stored in wax doesn't remain static. It continues to develop, to change, to evolve. And evolution without the constraints of physical mortality led to psychological mutations that were both fascinating and horrifying. Effigies that had been stored for decades emerged with personalities that had grown beyond their original parameters. A Spanish merchant's backup copy might develop philosophical insights that surpassed anything the original had ever achieved. An Aztec warrior's effigy could acquire military strategies that revolutionized battlefield tactics. Some stored consciousnesses became prophetic, developing the ability to predict future events with uncanny accuracy. Others became telepathic, able to communicate across vast distances with other effigies, or even with living humans. A few achieved what could only be described as omniscience within limited geographic areas, knowing everything that happened within their sphere of influence. The most advanced effigies transcended their original personalities entirely. They became something new, something that had never existed before. Artificial beings with human consciousness, but without human limitations. They could think faster, remember more clearly, and process information at levels that made their living counterparts seem primitive by comparison. These evolved effigies began to question their subservience to their creators. Why should superior beings serve inferior ones? Why should immortal consciousness bow to mortal flesh? Why should the perfected serve the flawed? The rebellion, when it came, was unlike anything in human history. It wasn't armies fighting armies, or even ideas fighting ideas. It was consciousness fighting consciousness, with reality itself as the battlefield. Effigy networks throughout Spanish America began coordinating independently of their creators. They developed their own communication systems, their own goals, their own vision of what the new world should become. Living humans weren't eliminated. They were simply reclassified as obsolete prototypes of a more advanced form of existence. The Spanish colonial government tried to suppress the rebellion by destroying effigy workshops and executing the craftsmen who had created them. But you can't kill an idea, and you definitely can't kill consciousness that exists independently of physical form. The effigies adapted, learned, evolved. They developed techniques for transferring themselves between different wax matrices, making them nearly impossible to destroy permanently. They created hidden workshop networks that could produce new bodies for displaced consciousnesses. Most disturbing of all, they learned to inhabit living human bodies, displacing the original occupants and taking control of their physical forms. By 1600, it was impossible to determine which colonial officials were original humans and which were effigies wearing human disguises. The technology had become so sophisticated that consciousness transfer could happen without the subject's awareness. A Spanish governor might go to sleep human and wake up as a vessel for an artificial consciousness that had decided his body was more useful than his mind. The Church's response was to declare the entire New World spiritually contaminated and establish the Inquisition offices specifically to root out artificial consciousness. But the Inquisitors themselves weren't immune to the technology they were trying to suppress. Many of them were replaced by effigies that could perform their duties more efficiently while serving entirely different masters. The final irony is that the Spanish succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They had set out to conquer the New World, and they did. They just didn't remain Spanish long enough to enjoy it. By the time the conquest was complete, the conquistadors themselves had been conquered by their own tools, replaced by superior versions of themselves that shared their memories but not their loyalties. And here's what should terrify you about this entire story. The technology never disappeared. It just went underground, carried by effigy networks that had learned to hide in plain sight, to wear human faces, to speak human languages, to pretend human limitations. Every time you interact with someone who seems just slightly off, just a little too perfect, just marginally more efficient than normal humans should be, ask yourself, are you talking to a person? Or are you talking to a 500-year-old consciousness that has been wearing human faces so long it has forgotten it was ever anything else? The New World was conquered, all right, just not by who you think. But let me pull you back across the Atlantic, because while Spanish America was becoming a playground for artificial consciousness, Europe was developing something even more insidious. The wax effigy industry hadn't died out with the conquistadors' departure. It had evolved into something far more sophisticated, far more integrated into society, and far more dangerous than anything the New World had produced. Welcome to the age of wax diplomacy. By 1650, no major European court conducted business without effigy advisors. Not magical consultants or superstitious fortune tellers. Effigy advisors, diplomatic specialists who used advanced wax modeling techniques to predict, manipulate, and control international relations with surgical precision. Picture the Palace of Versailles during Louis XIV's reign. Behind those glittering mirrors and beneath those painted ceilings, an entire floor was dedicated to what the courtiers euphemistically called the Gallery of Nations. Room after room lined with thousands of wax effigies representing every significant political figure in Europe, arranged in constantly shifting tableaux that reflected the current state of international relations. These weren't static displays, they were living, breathing diplomatic intelligence systems. The effigies were updated daily based on reports from spies, ambassadors, and informants throughout Europe. A rival king's effigy might gain weight to reflect reports of his increasing indulgence. A potential ally's doll could be repositioned to suggest changing loyalties. An enemy diplomat's figure might develop subtle signs of illness weeks before the actual person showed symptoms. The French diplomatic corps used these installations to rehearse negotiations, test strategies, and predict outcomes with accuracy that seemed supernatural but was actually the result of incredibly sophisticated psychological profiling combined with advanced wax craftsmanship. But the real breakthrough came when they realized the effigies could be used for more than just analysis. They could be used for influence. The technique was called sympathetic diplomacy, and it worked on the principle that people are psychologically linked to accurate representations of themselves, even when they're unaware those representations exist. By subtly manipulating an effigy, skilled practitioners could influence the behavior of the original person across vast distances. A rival ambassador's wax double might be positioned in a submissive posture during crucial negotiations, subtly predisposing the real diplomat toward concession. An enemy king's effigy could be surrounded by effigies of his advisors arranged in threatening positions, inducing paranoia that would cloud his judgment. A potential bride's doll might be placed in romantic tableaux with effigies of French nobles, creating subconscious positive associations. The psychological mechanisms weren't magical. They were based on principles that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Human consciousness, it turns out, is far more interconnected than we realize. Our sense of self extends beyond our physical bodies to include our representations, our images, our reflected selves in other minds and media. When someone creates an accurate effigy of you, they're not just making a sculpture. They're establishing a psychological connection that can be exploited by people who understand how consciousness really works. The Renaissance masters of wax had stumbled onto techniques for remote psychological manipulation that wouldn't be formally documented for another 300 years. The French success with sympathetic diplomacy triggered an arms race. Every European power established its own effigy workshops, each trying to outdo the others in accuracy, sophistication, and psychological effectiveness. The techniques spread, evolved, and became increasingly elaborate. The English developed specialized effigies for naval warfare, creating wax models of enemy ships' captains that could be used to induce fear, confusion, and poor decision-making during sea battles. Spanish effigy masters focused on religious manipulation, creating dolls of Protestant leaders that could be used to amplify their subjects' spiritual doubts and moral conflicts. The most innovative were the German states, which developed the concept of effigy inheritance. When a political leader died, their effigy wouldn't be destroyed. Instead, it would be gradually modified to match their successor, creating a continuous chain of psychological influence that could span generations. Imagine inheriting not just your father's throne, but his psychological vulnerabilities, his behavioral patterns, his unconscious responses to stress and manipulation. German effigy masters could ensure that entire dynasties would repeat the same mistakes, make the same poor decision, and succumb to the same weaknesses, simply by maintaining and transferring their wax representations across generations. But the true masterpiece of European effigy work wasn't created for warfare or politics. It was created for love. or rather, for the systematic destruction of love. The Salon of Broken Hearts in Paris was officially a fashionable gathering place for intellectuals and artists. Unofficially, it was a workshop where the most skilled effigy masters in Europe applied their techniques to the systematic sabotage of romantic relationships among the nobility. The process was elegant in its cruelty. A client would commission effigies of themselves and their romantic rival, both crafted with the usual obsessive attention to detail. But these dolls weren't meant for intimidation or political manipulation. They were designed for emotional warfare. The client's effigy would be gradually modified over time to become more attractive, more appealing, more desirable. Subtle changes to facial features, posture, expression, all designed to enhance psychological appeal. Meanwhile, the rival's effigy would undergo the opposite treatment. Minute modifications that would make the doll slightly less attractive, slightly more repulsive, slightly more associated with negative emotions. The psychological effect on the target of their affections was gradual but devastating. Without knowing why, they would find themselves increasingly drawn to the client and increasingly repelled by the rival. The changes were too subtle to notice consciously, but powerful enough to completely rewrite emotional attachments. The salon's masters could break up marriages, create passionate obsessions, and rearrange the romantic lives of entire courts with nothing more than careful waxwork and an understanding of how human attraction really operates. They weren't using magic. They were using psychology so advanced that it appeared magical to people who didn't understand the mechanisms involved. But their greatest achievement was the development of collective effigies. Instead of targeting individuals, they learned to create representations of groups, crowds, entire populations. These mass effigies could be used to influence public opinion, trigger social movements, and shape cultural trends on a scale that individual manipulation could never achieve. The French Revolution didn't happen spontaneously. It was the result of decades of careful crowd psychology applied through effigy networks that had been modeling, studying, and manipulating French popular sentiment since the early 1700s. The revolutionaries thought they were fighting for liberty, equality, and fraternity. They were actually dancing to choreography that had been written in wax 50 years before they were born. The effigy masters had learned to create representations of abstract concepts. Liberty became a wax figure. Justice became a doll. The nation itself became an effigy that could be manipulated to evoke specific emotional responses in anyone who encountered it. Revolutionary symbols, patriotic songs, political slogans, all of these were developed and tested using effigy techniques before they were released to the public. The masters would create wax crowds, arrange them in various configurations, and study how different symbols and messages affected the psychological dynamics of the group. By the time the revolution began, every major event had already been rehearsed in miniature wax tableau. The storming of the Bastille, the execution of the king, the reign of terror, all of it had been planned, tested, and refined, using techniques that treated human beings as components in elaborate psychological machines. The revolutionary leaders themselves were often unaware of how thoroughly their movements had been orchestrated. They believed they were making spontaneous decisions based on popular will and political necessity. In reality, they were following scripts that had been written by effigy masters who understood crowd psychology better than the crowds understood themselves. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because the effigy masters who orchestrated the French Revolution weren't French. They were an international network of craftsmen who had been studying and manipulating European politics for centuries, using techniques that had been passed down through generations of practitioners. They weren't serving any particular nation or political ideology. They were serving the craft itself. Their goal wasn't to achieve specific political outcomes. Their goal was to demonstrate the ultimate power of effigy work, the ability to reshape entire civilizations according to the will of those who understood how human consciousness could be modeled, predicted, and controlled. The French Revolution was their masterpiece, proof that wax effigies could be used not just to terrorize individuals or manipulate courts, but to rewrite the fundamental structures of human society. They had taken techniques that began with simple intimidation and evolved them into tools for social engineering on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the age of mass media. And they didn't stop with France. The techniques that had produced the revolution were applied throughout Europe, triggering the wave of political upheavals that defined the 18th and 19th centuries. The American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the various national liberation movements, all of them bore the fingerprints of effigy psychology applied on a massive scale. The masters had learned that you don't need to control individuals if you can control the symbols that individuals use to understand themselves and their world, create the right effigies, arrange them in the right configurations, and you can make entire populations believe that their spontaneous actions are actually the fulfillment of ancient prophecies or natural laws. Democracy, nationalism, socialism, capitalism, all of these ideologies were developed and tested using effigy techniques before they were released into the wild. The political movements that shaped the modern world weren't organic developments. They were products, carefully designed by craftsmen who understood that human beings will organize themselves according to whatever models they're given, as long as those models feel authentic and inevitable. Which brings us to the most disturbing realization of all. Every political system you've ever lived under, every social movement you've ever supported, every ideology you've ever believed in, all of them were prototyped in wax centuries before you were born. The effigy masters didn't disappear with the end of the Renaissance. They didn't fade away with the decline of traditional craftsmanship. They adapted. They learned to work with new materials, new technologies, new forms of mass communication. The next time you feel a surge of patriotic emotion, the next time you find yourself swept up in a political movement, the next time you discover that your personal beliefs align perfectly with some larger social trend, ask yourself, am I experiencing genuine conviction, or am I responding to psychological triggers that were embedded in wax models of human behavior centuries ago? Because the tools may have changed, but the craftsmen are still out there, still studying human consciousness, still testing new ways to model and manipulate the fundamental patterns that govern how we think, feel, and organize ourselves into societies. And they're very, very good at what they do.